The day I finally decided to leave my husband of 40 years. It wasn't because he hit me, or cheated on me, or even because he'd finally said something so cruel that it broke the last tether of my love for him. No, the violence and the cruelty had become a kind of quiet, ambient noise in my life, like the hum of a refrigerator you no longer hear. The day I decided to leave was the day he stood in my garden, a place of peace and beauty I had nurtured for decades, and he told me, with the calm, smiling finality of a god, that he was going to pave over my mother's roses. Hello, my dears. I'm Grandma Eleanor. I'm 78 years old, and I live now in a small cottage in the countryside of Virginia, where the morning mist hangs low over the fields, and the only sounds are the birds and the wind in the trees. It's a quiet life, a peaceful life, a life I had to fight very hard to get back. The story I am about to tell you is one that has lived in silence within the walls of my heart for most of my adult life. It is the story of a perfect marriage that was, in fact, a perfect prison. It's a truth I kept hidden, not just from the world, but for a long time, even from myself. To admit the truth would have been to admit that the man I had given my life to, the man everyone adored, was a stranger, a monster hiding behind the most charming and benevolent of masks. To admit that would have meant my entire life was a lie, and that was a weight too heavy for one woman to bear. So I suffered in silence, telling myself that this was just what marriage was, a series of small, quiet compromises, until you've compromised your entire soul away. Telling this story now, after all these years, feels like a betrayal. Not of him, God, no. It feels like a betrayal of the young, hopeful girl I once was, the one who believed so completely in the fairy tale. But I've learned that silence is the soil in which darkness grows best. It is the oxygen that evil breathes. And I have decided that it is time to suffocate it, to finally let the light and the air into the sealed rooms of my past. I am telling this for any person out there, man or woman, who feels their world shrinking, their voice growing quieter, their joy being slowly siphoned away by someone who claims to love them. Your presence here today, listening to an old woman's story, gives me a courage I didn't know I had. If you feel you can, a like on this video, or a subscription to my channel, Grandmother's Soliloquy, is more than just a number to me. It's a quiet show of solidarity. It's a chorus of voices telling me that my story, my truth, is worth something. And for that, I thank you from the very bottom of my heart. My story started not in darkness, but in the most brilliant, dazzling light. It all began in Philadelphia, in the early 1970s. I was a young librarian, quiet and studious, a woman who felt more at home in the hushed aisles of a library than at a loud party. I had my small, happy life, my books, my little apartment, my circle of friends. I was content. And then I met Richard. Meeting Richard was like the world switching from black and white to glorious technicolor. He was an architect, a rising star at a prestigious firm. He was devastatingly handsome, impossibly charming, and possessed a mind that was as sharp and brilliant as a cut diamond. We met when he came into my library, searching for a book on Renaissance art. He asked for my help, and within minutes, we were no longer talking about Brunelleschi's dome. We were talking about everything. Music, travel, our dreams for the future. He had a way of listening that made you feel like you were the most fascinating person he had ever met. He looked at me, a quiet librarian, as if I were a masterpiece he had just discovered. Our courtship was a dream, a whirlwind romance straight from the pages of a novel. He didn't just take me on dates, he created experiences. He took me to the opera, explaining the story with such passion that I was moved to tears. He took me on drives through the countryside, pointing out architectural details on old farmhouses that I had never noticed before. He courted my family with a grace and charm that left them utterly enchanted. My father, a stern, practical man, was captivated by his intelligence. My mother adored him. "He's the one, Eleanor," she told me, her eyes shining. "Don't you let this one get away." There was no chance of that. I was completely head over heels in love. He made me feel seen, cherished, and protected. He seemed to understand me better than I understood myself. "You have such a rich inner world, Eleanor," he would say, "but you keep it hidden. I want to build a life with you where you feel safe enough to let it flourish." He was promising to build me a sanctuary. How could I have known he was really designing a cage? We married 2 years later. It was a beautiful, tasteful wedding at a historic city inn. We bought a magnificent old stone house in a leafy, affluent suburb, a house that he, as an architect, promised to turn into our masterpiece. The first few years of our marriage were, by all accounts, perfect. I left my job at the library at his gentle urging. "A man like me, in my position, needs a wife who can manage our home and our social life, Eleanor," he explained. "It's a full-time job. It's a partnership. You'll be the director of domestic affairs." It sounded so important, so respectful. I didn't realize I was being retired from the world, my financial independence severed with a loving, logical smile. I poured my heart and soul into our home and into supporting his burgeoning career. I hosted immaculate dinner parties for his clients and partners. I learned about architecture so I could converse intelligently about his work. I was the perfect hostess, the perfect wife, a beautiful and serene accessory to his brilliant life. And I was happy. Or rather, I was convinced I was happy. His approval was the currency I lived on, and he was generous with it, as long as I played my part perfectly. The true joy of my life, my own private world, was my garden. The house came with a large, neglected backyard, and I set about transforming it. I had learned to love gardening from my mother. It was in my blood. I spent hours out there, my hands in the soil, coaxing life from the dirt. It was my sanctuary, my place of quiet creation. I didn't just plant neat rows of flowers. I created a sprawling, slightly wild English-style garden, full of secret corners, winding paths, and a riot of color and scent. The heart of the garden, the part that was most sacred to me, was a small circular bed near the back patio. There, I planted a dozen rose bushes, cuttings I had taken from my own mother's garden before she passed away. They were old, fragrant, heirloom roses, a living link to her, to my past. That patch of ground was the most precious place on earth to me. Richard, in the beginning, seemed to appreciate my passion. He would praise the beauty of the garden, often in front of guests. "Isn't she amazing?" he would say, draping an arm around my shoulders. "My brilliant wife, the artist. I design buildings of glass and steel, and she creates masterpieces with soil and sunlight." It made me glow with pride. He saw me. He valued my work. Our life looked perfect. From the outside, we were the ideal couple. Richard, the successful, brilliant architect, and Eleanor, his elegant, devoted wife with her magnificent garden. We were the envy of our friends. We had wealth, status, a beautiful home. We had, it seemed, everything. But now, looking back, I can see the insidious beginnings of the 10 years of silence. It didn't start with a shout. It started with a suggestion. I had a group of close friends from my library days, a boisterous, funny group of women I adored. We would meet for lunch once a month. Richard began to find subtle faults with them. "Carol is a dear, of course," he would say after I returned from a lunch. "But don't you find her a little loud, a little unsophisticated? It's important for us to surround ourselves with people who reflect our own standards, don't you think?" It was never a command, always a question posed with loving concern. He made me feel that my association with my old friends was somehow letting him down, holding us back. So I started making excuses. I became too busy for lunch. The calls dwindled. The friendships faded. I didn't realize he was deliberately, methodically, isolating me. He was pruning my life, cutting away any branch that didn't connect directly back to him. Then came the suggestions about me. My clothes were a little frumpy. My opinions on politics were a bit simplistic. He would correct me, always gently, always in private, framing it as an attempt to help me grow. "I want you to be the best version of yourself, my love," he would say. And I would feel a hot flush of shame, believing he was right, that I was somehow inadequate. The garden was the last bastion of my identity, the one thing that was truly mine. And then he began to turn his critical, architectural eye on it. "It's beautiful, Eleanor." Truly, he would begin, that familiar prelude to a criticism. "But it's a little chaotic, isn't it? A little messy, all this wildness. I was thinking a more structured design might be better. Clean lines, a formal layout. It would be more in keeping with the aesthetic of the house." He was calling my artistry messy. He was calling my sanctuary chaotic. He was telling me that my creation, the one thing that was wholly mine, was not up to his standards. That was the first time the knot of dread in my stomach felt cold and sharp. That was the beginning. He had isolated me from my friends. He was chipping away at my confidence, and now he was coming for my garden. He was coming for the last piece of my soul that was still mine. The 10 years of silence had begun, and I didn't even know how to scream. The decade that followed his first suggestion about my garden was not a period of loud, dramatic fights. It was a slow, creeping occupation of my soul. It was a war fought in whispers, in silences, in gestures so subtle that if I described them to an outsider, I would have sounded like a crazy, paranoid woman. Richard was a master architect, not just of buildings, but of reality itself. He had the uncanny ability to redefine my world, to gaslight me so expertly that I began to doubt my own perceptions, my own feelings, my own sanity. His campaign against the garden became his pet project, a symbol of his desire to impose his perfect, sterile order on the last corner of my life that was still truly mine. He never forbade me from working in it. That would have been too crude, too obviously controlling. Instead, he waged a war of 1,000 tiny cuts. He began by gifting me things for the garden, but they were his things, not mine. One year for my birthday, he presented me with a set of architectural plans he had drawn up. "A gift for you, my love," he announced over a candlelit dinner. "I've redesigned the garden. I've solved its structural problems." He unrolled the blueprint on the table. It showed a garden of severe, geometric flower beds, straight gravel paths, and a central, minimalist water feature. It was cold, boring, and utterly devoid of the life and spirit I had so carefully cultivated. It was a garden for an office park, not a home. I stared at the plans, my heart sinking. "But Richard," I managed to say, my voice small, I love the garden as it is. It's supposed to be a little wild. That's the point." He smiled, that patient, patronizing smile, the one he used when I was being simplistic. "Oh, Eleanor, you're thinking like a hobbyist. I'm thinking like a designer. This design has balance, harmony, a clear visual narrative. Your wildness is just clutter. It lacks intention. Don't worry," he added, patting my hand. "Don't worry," he added, patting my hand. "I'll hire a landscape architect to consult with you, to help you understand the principles." He was telling me that my art, my passion, was amateurish. He was telling me I needed a professional to understand what he wanted. He wasn't asking for my input. He was giving me my new reality. The project of destroying my garden was framed as an act of improving it, and my resistance was framed as ignorance. The inner turmoil was excruciating. A part of me, the young woman who had fallen in love with his brilliant mind, was tempted to believe him. Maybe he was right. Maybe my garden was messy and amateurish. But another part, a deeper, more instinctual part of me, knew this was a violation. It was an invasion. This wasn't about aesthetics. It was about control. It was about him conquering the last piece of territory that bore my signature instead of his. The dialogues we had about it were a form of psychological torture. He would use we and us to make it sound like a joint project, all while systematically dismantling my own vision. I was thinking we should replace those unruly climbing roses with some clean, modern espaliered pyracantha, he would say. "Don't you think that would be a more sophisticated statement?" Every question was a trap. If I said yes, I was agreeing to the destruction of my own work. If I said no, I was being difficult, unsophisticated, and ungrateful for his help. I fought back, but my battles were small, quiet, and ultimately losing ones. I would try to reason with him. But Richard, these roses were my mother's. They mean something to me. His response would be swift and devastatingly logical. I understand that, my love. I do. But sentimentality can't be the guiding principle of good design. We must be objective. We can't let emotional clutter compromise the integrity of the overall vision. He made my love for my mother sound like a design flaw. He made my heart's attachment seem like a weakness. He started buying me gardening books, but they were all books on formal French and Italian garden design, on minimalist Japanese rock gardens. He would leave them on my bedside table. The unspoken message was clear. This is what a sophisticated garden looks like. This is what you should aspire to. Not your messy, emotional, English nonsense. I began to feel a creeping sense of dread every time I went into my garden. My sanctuary had become a source of anxiety. I would look at a blooming, unruly rosebush, and instead of feeling joy, I would feel a pang of fear, knowing that he saw it as a problem to be solved. He had infected my paradise with his judgment. His control bled out from the garden into every other corner of my life. He took over our finances completely. It started innocently enough. You have so much to deal with, Eleanor, with the house and the garden. Let me take the burden of the bills off your shoulders. It sounded like a kindness. But soon, I had no idea how much money we had, how it was being spent. I was given a weekly allowance for groceries and household expenses. I, a grown woman in my 50s, had to ask my husband for money if I wanted to buy a new dress. It was a slow, humiliating infantilization. He curated my reality. He started screening my phone calls. I would pick up the phone, and he would be on the extension in his study. Just wanted to make sure it wasn't an important business call, darling, he'd say breezily if I commented on it. Soon my friends' calls stopped coming altogether. I learned later he had been telling them I was going through a difficult time and needed my rest. He was painting a picture of me as a fragile, unstable woman, all while being the very cause of my fragility and instability. My world shrank until it was the size of our beautiful stone house. My only companion was the silence, a silence filled with his unspoken criticism and my unspoken fear. I felt like I was fading, becoming a ghost in my own life. I would look in the mirror and see a stranger, a pale, anxious woman with sad eyes. Where was the girl who had laughed on the roof with her friends? Where was the librarian who had debated philosophy with the charming stranger? I was gone. Richard had successfully redesigned me, just as he wanted to redesign my garden. I was clean, orderly, and lifeless. There were moments, flashes of the old me, where I would try to push back. I remember one evening, some friends of his were over for dinner. The conversation turned to politics, and I voiced a differing opinion on some policy. I did it quietly, respectfully, but it was a dissent. Richard didn't say anything at the time. He just gave me a brief, cold look. But later that night, after the guests had left, he turned to me, his face a mask of cold fury. "What did you think you were doing, Eleanor?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous hiss. "I was just participating in the conversation, Richard. No, you were embarrassing me. You were contradicting me in front of my colleagues. You made us look like we weren't a united front. Your opinion, when it differs from mine, is to be kept to yourself. Is that understood? But I have a right to my own thoughts," I whispered, my voice trembling. "You have a right to think whatever you want in the privacy of your own head," he said, stepping closer. "But you do not have the right to undermine me. Your role is to support me, to agree with me. That is the deal. And if you can't hold up your end of the bargain, then the deal is off." The threat hung in the air, unspoken but terrifying. The deal is off. What did that mean? Divorce? Financial ruin? Being cast out into a world I no longer knew? He had me trapped, and he knew it. After that night, I learned to keep my opinions to myself. The silence grew deeper. My health began to suffer. I had constant headaches, a perpetual knot of anxiety in my stomach. I couldn't sleep. I went to our doctor, who prescribed tranquilizers. It's stress, he said kindly. A woman in your position, managing a large home, a social life. It can be overwhelming. Even my doctor saw the illusion Richard had created. I took the pills. They dulled the edges of my fear, but they also dulled the rest of me, wrapping me in a thick, gray fog. I was becoming the fragile, delicate creature Richard had always told me I was. Why didn't I leave? It's the question everyone asks. The question I asked myself 1,000,000 times in the dead of night. But you have to understand, it's like asking a prisoner why they don't just walk out of their cell. The bars of my prison were invisible. They were made of love, of dependency, of fear, of the crushing weight of public opinion. He was Richard, the brilliant, charming architect. I was his wife. Who would believe me? They would say I was ungrateful, hysterical, menopausal. He had spent decades building his reputation and demolishing mine. He had isolated me so completely that I had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. And a part of me, a small brainwashed part, still loved the man I thought he was, the man I had married. I was mourning a man who was still alive, while being terrorized by the stranger who had taken his place. My garden was my only escape. It was the only place I felt a flicker of the old me. I would spend hours out there, my hands in the dirt, and for a little while, I could breathe. I stubbornly, quietly, resisted his redesign. I would move the expensive minimalist planters he bought me to a forgotten corner. I would continue to nurture my wild, messy flowers. It was a small, pathetic rebellion, but it was mine. And he knew it. It infuriated him. He saw my quiet defiance in the garden as the last outpost of my independence, and he became obsessed with conquering it. He would walk through the garden with me, pointing out all its flaws. This whole area is just sad, Eleanor. These old dying roses, they're a symbol of the past. They're holding the whole garden back. He was talking about my mother's roses. He was calling my living connection to her sad and dying. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. It was a deliberate, calculated strike at the very heart of me. And it was in that moment, as he stood there, smiling, looking at my beautiful, fragrant, living roses and calling them dead, that something inside me began to shift. The fog of the tranquilizers began to lift. The fear was still there, but for the first time in a long time, it was joined by a spark. A tiny, hard, cold spark of pure, unadulterated rage. The final assault on my garden, and on my soul, came on a beautiful, sun-drenched Saturday morning in June. I had woken up feeling a rare sense of peace. I had spent the previous day working in the garden, and the air was filled with the scent of blooming roses and freshly turned earth. I went downstairs to make coffee, feeling almost like my old self. Richard was already at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in hand, a blueprint spread out before him. This was not unusual. He often worked on weekends. But there was an air of triumphant finality about him that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Good morning, my love," he said, his smile wider and more predatory than usual. "I have wonderful news. The final piece of our home's masterpiece is about to be put in place." I looked at him, then at the blueprint. It wasn't for a building. It was a landscape design, a hardscape design. It showed a large, circular flagstone patio, an outdoor kitchen, and a multi-level deck. It was a beautiful design, I suppose. For a hotel resort. "What is this, Richard?" I asked, my voice a wary whisper. "It's the solution to our backyard problem, Eleanor," he announced, his voice booming with false magnanimity. "I've been working on it for months. A proper outdoor living space, a place to entertain. It will increase the value of the property exponentially." I stared at the drawing, my mind struggling to orient it. And then I saw it. The large circular patio, the centerpiece of his design, was exactly where my mother's rose garden was. Where are the roses?" I asked, my heart beginning to pound a slow, heavy drum beat of dread. This was the moment. He looked me straight in the eye, the charming mask gone, replaced by a look of cold, hard victory. He didn't even bother to soften the blow. The roses. Oh, they'll be going, of course, he said, with a casual wave of his hand, as if he were talking about taking out the trash. They're old, diseased, and in the way. Pave it over. The words hung in the air, obscene and monstrous. He was going to pave over my mother's roses. He was going to pour concrete over the last living piece of my history, my identity, my heart. He wasn't just redesigning my garden. He was salting the earth of my soul. And in that instant, 10 years of silent suffering, of quiet compromises, of swallowed tears and unspoken rage, coalesced into a single clarifying point of light. The fog was gone. The fear was gone. The submissive, frightened woman he had so carefully created simply vanished. I looked at this man, this stranger at my kitchen table, and I saw him for what he truly was, a vandal, a parasite who had fed on my life, my joy, my very being, until there was almost nothing left. And now he was coming for the last, sacred thing. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. A strange glacial calm settled over me. No, I said. My voice was quiet, but it was not the voice of a mouse. It was the sound of a glacier cracking. He looked at me, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. No? What do you mean, no? Eleanor, the decision has been made. The crew is booked. Cancel them, I said, my voice gaining strength. He actually laughed, a short, sharp, disbelieving bark. You're being sentimental and ridiculous. It's a patch of dirt with some dying flowers. They are not dying, I said, my voice as cold and hard as his heart. And you will not touch them. He stood up then, his full height looming over me. He was used to me cowering, flinching. But I didn't. I stood my ground, my eyes locked on his. I am your husband, Eleanor, he said, his voice dropping to a low, threatening growl. And you will do as you are told. Not anymore, I said. That was it. The declaration of war. The turning point of my life. He stared at me for a long moment, his mind clearly struggling to process this new reality, this mutiny. Then he turned and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. I knew he wasn't giving up. He was just regrouping. He would be back, and he would come back with more pressure, more manipulation, more threats. But this time, I would be ready. The woman he was coming back for was not the woman he had left. My awakening was a quiet, furious storm. I spent the rest of that Saturday in a state of hyper-focused clarity. The part of my brain that had been dormant for a decade, the librarian's mind, the one that knew how to research, to organize, to find information, roared back to life. He had underestimated me. He had seen me as a domestic accessory, a simple-minded hobbyist. He had forgotten that I was intelligent, that I was capable. He had forgotten who I was before he had redesigned me. My fight back started in his own office, a room I hadn't entered in years. While he was out, cooling off, I went inside. It was his inner sanctum, a monument to his ego. But it was also where he kept his life. I wasn't looking for love letters from a mistress. His affair wasn't with another woman. It was with his own power and success. I was looking for financial documents. He had always been careless, his arrogance leading him to believe no one would ever dare to look through his things. And I found what I was looking for. Tucked away in a filing cabinet, I found folders detailing offshore bank accounts, secret investments, documents that showed he had been systematically hiding millions of dollars from our shared marital assets for years. He hadn't just been emotionally bankrupting me. He had been financially preparing to discard me, should I ever become too much trouble. He had been building his escape route while sealing all of mine. I took out my phone, my hands steady, and I photographed every single document. Page after page of his secret, selfish life. It was a treasure trove of his betrayal. But I knew that wasn't enough. A divorce could get messy. He was a powerful man with powerful friends. He could drag it out for years, bleed me dry with legal fees. I needed more. I needed leverage that was not just financial, but personal. I needed to find the one thing he valued more than money, his reputation. His perfect, unassailable public image as a brilliant, ethical architect. My mind went back through the years, searching for a crack in his professional facade. And then I remembered. Years ago, there was a big project he had worked on, a new wing for the city's art museum. There had been a scandal. A contractor had been accused of using substandard materials, of cutting corners. The contractor was ruined, but Richard had emerged from it all untouched, even praised for his diligence in uncovering the problem. But I remembered him having hushed, angry phone calls in his study late at night. I remembered him meeting with that contractor, a man whose name I had long forgotten. I spent the next hour online, in the public archives of the city's newspapers. I searched for every article about the museum scandal, and I found the contractor's name, a man named Frank Miller. A quick search showed that Frank Miller had lost his business, his home, and had been fighting legal battles for years. He had been professionally and financially destroyed. I had a hunch, a wild, desperate idea. I found a phone number for a Frank Miller in a less affluent part of the state. I took a deep breath, walked out into my garden, stood beside my mother's roses, and I made the call. An older, weary-sounding man answered. "Hello. Is this Mr. Frank Miller?" I asked, my heart pounding. "Who's asking?" he said, his voice thick with suspicion. "My name is Eleanor Sterling," I said. "I am Richard Sterling's wife." There was a long, dead silence on the other end of the line. Then he let out a short, bitter laugh. "Well, I'll be damned. After all these years. What do you want, Mrs. Sterling?" calling to gloat. "No, Mr. Miller," I said, my voice low and steady. "I'm calling to help you get your life back. I believe my husband set you up to take the fall for his own mistakes, and I think I can prove it." I spent the next hour on the phone with Frank Miller. I listened to his story, a story of a good man who had been systematically destroyed by a powerful, ruthless architect who needed a scapegoat to cover up his own design flaws and shoddy oversight. My hunch had been right. Richard had not just ruined my life, he had a history of it. I told Frank about the financial documents I had found. I told him I was leaving Richard and that I was prepared to testify on his behalf, to provide any information I could. A new energy came into his weary voice, a spark of the fight he thought he had lost. We made a plan. He would contact his lawyer. I would contact mine. When Richard came home that evening, he was a different man. His rage had cooled into a confident, condescending calm. He had clearly decided on a new tactic. He found me in the living room. "Eleanor," he said, his voice oozing with fake sympathy, "I've been thinking, and I understand. You're attached to those roses. I was insensitive. I've canceled the work crew for Monday." I looked at him, my face a carefully blank slate. My heart was pounding, but I showed nothing. "Thank you, Richard," I said quietly. "But," he continued, "we do need to have a serious conversation. About you. About your health. I'm worried, my love. This emotional outburst today, your increasing forgetfulness, your attachment to the past. I've made an appointment for you to see a doctor, a specialist, a psychiatrist. I think you might be having some kind of breakdown, and I want to get you the best help possible." There it was, his checkmate move. He was going to have me declared mentally incompetent, unstable. He would get power of attorney over me, over my assets. He would put me in a home, a comfortable, expensive one, of course, for the sake of appearances. And then he would be free to do whatever he wanted with the house, the garden, the money. He would do it all under the guise of loving, concerned care. It was a brilliant, evil, and utterly terrifying plan. The old Eleanor would have crumpled. She would have dissolved into a puddle of fear and self-doubt. But the new Eleanor, the woman who had spent the afternoon gathering an arsenal, just looked at him. I let him finish his little speech. I let him paint the picture of his loving concern. Then I smiled. It was a real smile, my first in a long time. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated power. "That won't be necessary, Richard," I said, my voice calm and clear. "I won't be going to see your doctor. But I have made an appointment for you. With my lawyer. He'll be serving you with divorce papers tomorrow morning. And he'll be serving you along with my new friend, Frank Miller's lawyer, who is reopening his case against you, citing new evidence." I believe the words are fraud and professional misconduct. I watched the color drain from his face. The confident, smug expression dissolved into a mask of pure, slack-jawed shock. He looked like he had been physically struck. And as for my health, I continued, standing up and walking towards the door, I've never felt better in my life. I'll be staying with a friend for a while. You and your things will need to be out of my house by the end of the month. Yours. I paused at the door and looked back at him, at the ruins of the man who had tried to ruin me. And Richard, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper, don't touch my roses. I walked out of that house and I did not look back. The feeling was not one of sadness or loss. It was a feeling of exhilarating, terrifying freedom. It was like taking the first breath of clean, fresh air after being trapped in a stale, airless room for a decade. I drove to the home of one of my old library friends, Carol, the one he had called loud and unsophisticated. I had called her that morning, after my call with Frank Miller, and before she could even ask, I just said, Carol, I need you. And her response, after years of my neglect, was simply, my door is always open for you, Elle. Come home. The legal battle was everything he had feared and I had hoped for. The threat of a reopened lawsuit from Frank Miller, with me as the star witness, was the lever that broke his back. The last thing his carefully cultivated reputation could withstand was a public scandal that painted him as a fraud. And the evidence of his financial deceit, the offshore accounts and hidden assets, was irrefutable. He was trapped. The master architect had been outmaneuvered. He didn't fight. He couldn't. His lawyers advised him to settle, and to settle quickly and quietly. The divorce was finalized in record time. I got the house, my house, free and clear. I got more than half of our declared assets, and a substantial portion of the hidden money my lawyer was able to uncover. He was forced to pay a massive settlement to Frank Miller, a settlement that not only restored Frank's finances, but also came with a public statement acknowledging oversights in the museum project, a carefully worded admission that effectively resurrected Frank's reputation and buried Richard's. He lost everything he truly valued. He didn't go to prison, but he suffered a fate that for a man like him was far worse. He lost his reputation. The whispers followed him everywhere. He lost his status. He was asked to resign from the boards of the charities he sat on. His powerful friends suddenly became very busy. He had to sell his company, his masterpiece of a firm. He was a pariah in the city he had once ruled. The last I heard, he had moved to Florida, living in a small condominium, a bitter, diminished man who had been undone by a simplistic librarian and a patch of old roses. He had paved over his own life. My life, on the other hand, began again. The first thing I did after the divorce was final was to walk into my garden. My garden. I stood before my mother's roses, their petals dappled in the afternoon sun, and I wept. I wept for the years I had lost, for the woman I had allowed myself to become. I wept for the silence, for the fear. But they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of cleansing, like a long, hard rain washing the dirt away. I spent the next year reclaiming my life. I reconnected with my old friends, who welcomed me back with open arms, and no judgment, only love. I began to travel, to see the world he had told me I was too unsophisticated to appreciate. I went to Italy and saw Brunelleschi's dome for myself, and I wept with the sheer beauty of it. I found my voice again, my opinions, my laughter. I remembered who I was, and I sold the big stone house. It held too many ghosts, too many silent, painful memories. It was his masterpiece, not mine. I sold it and used the money to buy this small cottage here in Virginia, a place where the air is clean and the world is quiet in a good way. And I brought my roses with me. I carefully dug up each one of my mother's bushes, wrapped their roots in burlap, and transported them here. They are the heart of my new garden, a garden that is wild and messy and full of life, a garden that is all mine. The lesson I learned from my long silent decade is a simple one, but it is one that is carved on my soul. I learned that abuse is not always about black eyes and broken bones. It is often a quiet, creeping thing. It is the slow, systematic erosion of your confidence, the isolation from your friends, the silencing of your voice, the dismissal of your joy. It is being told, in 1,000 subtle ways, that you are not enough. It is a murder of the soul, and the weapon is often disguised as love. My advice to you, my dears, is this. Do not ignore the small things. Do not dismiss that little flicker of wrongness in your gut. If someone who claims to love you is making your world smaller, they do not love you. They love the power they have over you. If they are silencing your voice, it is because they are afraid of what you have to say. True love, real love, makes your world bigger. It wants to hear your voice, even when it disagrees. It celebrates your passions, even if it doesn't understand them. It doesn't pave over your roses. It helps you water them. Never, ever let anyone convince you that their love requires the sacrifice of your soul. You are not a project to be redesigned. You are a masterpiece all on your own. It took me a long time to get here, to this place of peace, but I am here, and I am grateful for every single day of this quiet, authentic life. The silence I live in now is not a silence of fear. It is a silence of serenity, a silence filled with the scent of roses and the knowledge that I am, at long last, free. Thank you for allowing me to break my own silence with you today. It is a precious gift. If my story has touched you, please consider showing your support by liking, subscribing, and sharing. You never know who might need to hear that it's not too late to start fighting back. Love, Grandma Eleanor. See you in the next story.